We have Samantha Schnee and Carmen Boullosa, who are here to talk about a new book that is forthcoming from Deep Vellum called The Book of Eve, written by Carmen and translated by Samantha. So I'll give a little bit of an introduction to both of them, and then Carmen will give us an introduction to the book. Okay? Carmen Boullosa is one of Mexico's leading novelists, poets, and playwrights, and is also a distinguished lecturer at City College of New York. She has received numerous prizes and honors, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, has published 19 novels that have been translated into Italian, Dutch, German, French, Portuguese, and Russian, Chinese as well. In addition to the forthcoming Book of Eve, 3 of these have been published by Deep Vellum Press in English translation. And Samantha is the founding editor of Words Without Borders. Her translation of Carmen Boullosa's Texas, The Great Theft, was shortlisted for the PEN America Translation Prize in 2015. And her translation of Boullosa's El Libro de Eva, which was shortlisted for the Mario Vargas Llosa Biennial Novel Prize, is forthcoming from Deep Vellum, as I've mentioned. She's recipient of the 2023 National Endowment for the Arts Literature Fellowship to translate a new novel, Boullosa's El Complot de los Románticos.
Dante hits the road.
Huh?
Dante hits the road.
It hits the road?
Dante
hits the road.
Dante hits the road.
Maybe. English title.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
good.
I said it so she doesn't chicken with she signs to it.
So welcome, both of you. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for receiving us. Thank you all for being with us today. I was brought by my parents were very Catholic, very religious. During years of my childhood, I went daily to Mass. And they read, my father loved to read aloud and always read her daughters, the 3 older daughters, whatever he was reading to put us to sleep. And obviously he read us repeatedly several times the Genesis. And Eve was always there. Eve was a character, a fixed character. And one day, I imagine some 7 years ago, more or less, I thought, visiting a museum, the museum of the Templo Mayor in Mexico City Museum, I was watching this incredible monolith of a goddess that is about to devour us all while she's giving birth to all of us. And I was looking at her and I thought of Eve, thinking, how strange, Eve is so different. She's so bland, this immense goddess there, the giver of all life, right in front of me, looking with the original colors that the archaeologists have rescued. They have her set in an incredible way that you feel her power, and you also feel some fear because she is also the mother of death. She's the mother of life, and she's the mother of death. And I said inside of me, oh, well, Eve was so different. And I thought, how strange that she's so different. It's obvious that the idea of the mother, well, she's the mother, but she has so much power that she's something to fear. Why this Eve? So I started first, I asked the web, then didn't get much. Then I asked the library and I started finding material, not for a novel. I was not thinking of a novel. I just wanted to understand how come Eve was like that, mute, passive, creator of all our pains, working is terrible, having children is terrible, all this fatalist vision. And I found Robert Graves' book on Patay and Robert Graves on the Jewish myths, and it was fascinating, and the amount of notes on it and the books that it opened and the material, suddenly I was deep into Eve, and I had lots of material about her. I didn't know what to do with them. I didn't know if it was just answering my question. Eve had been different. She was fixed as the Eve of the Genesis when Teresa de Avila, Saint Teresa de Avila, was founding her convents in the middle of the Reformation, Counter-Reformation, and that's the version they wanted. This crowd of men, you have seen the Council of Trento painted, all these men in skirts, yes, but all men, deciding that was Eve. By the way, also the Genesis has some narrative gaps that I don't understand how they didn't have an editor to correct them. Some things there, not repetition, but changing it a bit. Well, so I was obsessed, and I thought the obsession was going to end there with my answers to myself. But suddenly I started listening to her. I listened to her voice. She wanted to tell her story. And I didn't trust myself. I thought this cannot be. I cannot write, but I did it. I wrote the book. And the book follows a little bit the structure of the old versions of Genesis, meaning there's one authorized voice that is Eve in this book, and there are many papers that contradict what she's saying. Some papers appear that say, no, she's lying, especially her daughters. Obviously, a powerful woman, the creator of all life, she had to have ruthless daughters, and they contradict the mother. But also Adam, that he's not precisely well portrayed in the book. He also wants to say his version, so he speaks, and Cain speaks, and Abel speaks, little papers that appear there in the middle of the book. As Eve is the one that tells the story, and the story is different, she loves to arrive to the earth. She loved the taste of the apple. She found great to leave the Eden, because the Eden was odorless. There was no life there. So she arrives to the earth and she likes it. And all the tiles of the story started falling differently. Eve did the Genesis, all of it. So Babel has to be different, and the passage we have selected to read to you today is a fragment of what happens between Cain and Abel. The original, the Genesis, the biblical Genesis says that Cain was the gardener. He was the one who cultivated, the farmer, while Abel was the shepherd and the one who killed animals. So that gave me also, me and Eve, another sense of them both. And the story needed a real explanation for Cain, who was not precisely violent, and Abel, who had to be violent because he murdered what he bred. So we are going to read a little passage. I don't know if that introduction is enough. I'm first going to read in Spanish, luckily, and then Samantha, luckily, is going to read this fragment 63 in English. Before that, we have seen already Cain had arrived to the house carrying a wheel that he's done like a toy. You've seen that. The boys in the towns, they play with a wheel they've done, and they play with it. He has arrived, and there's been a little incident between them. And Eve takes Abel out so they stop quarreling, the two brothers. 63. Aquí relataré lo que Caín y yo sentimos que ocurría en ausencia. Apunto estampas breves al no haber estado ahí porque yo solo escribo lo vivido. A nuestra salida se calmaron los ánimos. Estaban a la espera de nuestro regreso para sentarse a comer. Las dos hermanas menores jugaban con la rueda, atinando a hacerla girar erguida sobre sus bordes. Una de ellas caminó llevándola vertical a su lado, arreándola con la palma de su mano. Persiguiendo la rueda, salieron en dirección opuesta a la que nosotros habíamos tomado antes. Iban riendo, olvidadas del pleito ocurrido. Adán no estaba ahí, no sé dónde había ido. Solo Ara y Abel seguían en la cocina, primero como dos bultos inmóviles, luego que Ara se acercó a la masa del pan para volverla a amasar. Entonces Abel brincó tras ella como un resorte y la atenazó con sus dos brazos por la espalda, estrujándola. ¿Lascivo? La masa del pan cayó al suelo. Ara se zafó del abrazo hostil y se defendió de Abel. Arañó, pegó. Abel la pescó otra vez, de nuevo por la espalda. Ara lo golpeó en la cabeza, se soltó una vez, tomó una cazuela, se la aventó, tras esta un plato, un vaso, los trozos de barro roto crujían bajo sus pasos. Abel golpeó a Ara con una vasija, rompiéndosela en la cabeza. Atacándose uno al otro, pisoteaban sin notarlo la sagrada masa del pan. Abel agarró el cuchillo de hueso que él había tallado. Contribución suya a la cocina. Se acercó a Ara amenazándola con el filo. Ara extendió el brazo hacia su espalda y alcanzó el cantarito. Lo estrelló contra la frente de Abel. Abel, sin soltar el mango del cuchillo, saltó sobre Ara, la tumbó jalándole los cabellos. Ella lo arañó, lo golpeó. Abel puso la punta de su arma en el cuello de Ara y teniéndola así acorralada, la tumbó entre los trozos de barro y la ya para entonces embarrada masa del pan. Así forjó la entrada de su tripa en ella. Con violencia la penetró lastimándola. Adán entró cuando la escena sucedía, cuando aún el cuchillo apuntaba al cuello, cuando aún Abel montaba como un animal a Ara, cuando aún Ara clavaba sus uñas en la espalda de Abel arañándolo. Adán gritó a Abel: ¿Qué haces, Abel? Abel retiró el cuchillo del cuello de Ara, soltó a Ara, semidesnudo como estaba, el miembro erguido, rodó para acostarse de espaldas en el piso y dar la cara a Adán. Yo no lo hice, actuó sin mi permiso esta parte de mi cuerpo. Adán se encogió de hombros sin dar una mano a Ara para levantarse. Ara levantó el torso del suelo herida, algunos cortes por el barro en la espalda, las uñas rotas, el rostro golpeado, bramó: y esa parte la hiciste tú, lo sé yo y lo sabes tú, Adán. Eso es tu hechura. Y con eso que por tenerlo tú lo tiene también Abel, con eso me lastimó. Él lo entró en mí en contra de mi voluntad, hiriéndome de algo que no puedo sanar. Ada soltó a llorar inmóvil, sin sollozos, como una piedra de la que brota agua. Adán encolerizó. Abel se levantó, aventó una patada a Ara. Ara le aventó encima el cuenco de madera que alcanzaron sus manos. Adán, agachándose, la tomó del puño. Aquello siguió, Adán y Abel contra Ada, hiriéndola ahí en su botón de placer, ahí con sus miembros y con los objetos que pudieron. Ese horror fue lo que Caín y yo percibimos a la distancia, sintiendo el espanto y el dolor de la escena. Adán y Abel se retiraron y Ara se arrastró. Le era imposible caminar a su lecho.
Vamos a ver. Chapter 63. Cain and I see what we didn't see.
Speak up just a little bit.
Here I'll tell the story of what Cain and I felt was happening in our absence. I'll sketch it briefly since we weren't there, and I normally write only about my own experience. When we left, tempers calmed. They waited for our return to sit down and eat. The two youngest sisters were playing with the wheel, trying to figure out how to make it turn upright on its edges. One of them tried to keep it next to her as she walked, pushing it along with her palm. Following the wheel, they headed in the opposite direction from us. They were laughing, the earlier quarrel already forgotten. Adam wasn't there. I don't know where he had gone. Only Adam and Ada remained in the kitchen, sitting there like two lumps. Then Ada went over to the dough to start kneading it again. Then Abel jumped behind her, pinning her arms behind her back, squeezing her. Lasciviously? The dough fell to the floor. Ada freed herself from his hostile grip and defended herself against Abel. She scratched, she hit. Abel caught her from behind again. Ada hit him on the head, freeing herself once more. She picked up a pot and threw it at him, then a plate, then a cup, the pieces of broken pottery crunching beneath their feet. Abel hit Ada with a cooking pot, breaking it on her head. Attacking each other, they didn't notice. They were trampling the sacred dough. Abel grabbed the knife he had carved out of bone, his contribution to the kitchen. He approached Ada, threatening her with its tip. Ada reached behind her for the jug and smashed it on Abel's forehead. Without releasing his grip on the knife, Abel lunged at Ada, pulling her down by her hair while she scratched him and hit him. Abel held the tip of his weapon against Ada's throat, pushing her into the bits of pottery and the muddy dough. He forced his thing into her violently, penetrating her, hurting her. Adam walked in when this was happening, when the knife was still at her throat, when Abel was mounting Ada like an animal, while Ada dug her nails into Abel's back, clawing at him. Adam shouted, "Abel, what are you doing?" Abel removed the knife from Ada's throat. He let Ada go. Half naked on the floor, his thing standing erect, he rolled over onto his back to look at Adam. "It's not my fault. This part of my body acted of its own accord." Adam shrugged his shoulders. He didn't help Ada up from the floor. Ada sat up, wounded, cuts on her back from the shards of pottery, her nails broken, her face beaten, and roared at Adam. "And you made that thing. I know it, and you know it too, Adam. This is your doing, and because you have one, Abel has one too, and he hurt me with his. He put it in me against my will, making a wound that can't be healed." Ada began to cry, still as a rock that water bubbles forth from, making no sound. Adam became angry. Abel got up and kicked at Ada. Ada threw a wooden bowl, which was within her reach, at him. Adam bent down, grabbing her by the head. And so it continued, Adam and Abel against Ada, wounding her there where she was meant to feel pleasure, there where with their own things and with other things too. This was the horror that Cain and I had felt from afar, sensing the terror and the pain of this scene. Adam and Abel left, and Ada dragged herself, she was unable to walk, to her bed.
So that's an intense scene.
Maybe I should have chosen something less dramatic.
Well, you want to say some follow-up comments on this particular scene? Either one of you? Do you want to say what
Well,
happens?
I think it's in the violence that enters the household is the violence that Adam has felt for some time in the book, in this version. He doesn't join the adventure of maternity. He can't, and he starts constructing the version of the Genesis we know, we've read. He starts building it. And the mistake of Eve is that she has her first child, Cain, and then she has a second child and decides to give it to Adam to soothe his pain. And Adam educates Abel in the violence he feels, he's the one that kills animals, he's the one that has this attitude towards everything. So brings the violence to the domestic order. And Eve is not non-guilty to say so, or not. She is responsible. She's responsible because she didn't build her relationship with Adam properly. She didn't do what she should have. She only paid him back with a son. And so we see her family has this rotten core, to say so, that falls into other situations. So I chose this passage because it is like in the cusp of the book.
Mm-hmm. And I think you had another point you wanted to make about.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of it's dramatic and it's a kind of negative point to end on, but then when you read the book, you see that actually something beautiful comes out of that situation in the end. And as I was saying to you, Shelby, it answers one of the kind of primary questions that the Bible raises, which is there's Adam and Eve, and then how did we end up with a human race, right? Like someone had to be begat by someone else, and so you couldn't write about a book about Genesis or about Eve without addressing that question.
Yes, but that question didn't need necessarily to be violent, because here evidently, rape is not to procreate people, it's an act of violence. So it's only entering this, showing the mechanic of violence that has entered the household. And maybe I could have solved it different if Eve, because she told me the story, if Eve would have solved her issues with Adam, because she very well knows that they are different from the animals. They can't have children the same way. They try to have a baby differently. It doesn't work. And they finally have her, she gets the baby, and that's when he can't make it. He just can't stand it. He's out of the game, he thinks. And she doesn't invite him to the game and doesn't have him in the game.
Well, and he was also already showing signs of jealousy, even before this, right?
Yes, yes.
And
he
what
didn't want to leave the Eden.
Right.
He liked it.
Right. And the more power she gained, the more angry and resentful and he became. But what I think is interesting in this book is that he breaks in and tells his story occasionally because he gets fed up or whatever, and she doesn't correct him. She's silent. She doesn't say anything. So what do we make of that?
That's her problem. That's why she doesn't solve her issues with Adam. And they are both of them, they create what we call family and what we call not a matriarcado, but a patriarcado. And what makes that kind of order, in the book we see all that happening fast. I say she's also responsible. Nevertheless, I do like her. She's so full of joy and fun and pleasure, and she's all the time creating things. She makes the first pot, the first dress, the cooking she likes. So I kind of like her, and I see nobody's perfect, but as they are placed in this moment, everything they do means so much.
So in this novel, just to back up a little bit, Eve is not only the first woman, she doesn't only give life, but she discovers fire, she begins cooking, she makes our daily bread, she...
Art.
art.
Yes.
She does cave paintings, I guess we would call it now, right? So she is the person driving all of this early life on earth.
Yes, because Adam didn't want to leave the paradise. He was comfortable there.
Yeah.
He didn't desire to be out.
And he was a little afraid too.
He was afraid. And when they see the earth, they are there, looking, wow. And he finds it terrifying, and she finds it fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
They are
And
different.
the angel too, when they have the encounter with the angel.
With the angel, yes.
Yeah.
He doesn't like the angel. She likes too much.
It's true.
So you mentioned in some of your research that you had, especially you came across the Robert Graves that has the Jewish conception of Eve. Were there other origin myths you came across in your research where Eve was more powerful than we see her in the Genesis we know?
In many of the footnotes and versions of former versions of the Genesis, yes, she was much more powerful. I didn't include Lilith, which enraged the Lilith followers. I was a Lilith follower when I was a teen. I liked Lilith. I wrote a play of Lilith. A friend of mine, I convinced her, and she did songs on Lilith, and it was all this fascination for Lilith that is the contrary of Eve. But I understood with this Eve that she was both. She didn't need that other one. And in versions that Graves talks about, there was no Lilith. There was one, and she was both. And then many Liliths appear, different sorts of Liliths. There are many there, many characters. I haven't returned to the Graves book, by the way.
You have not?
No, I have not now. I finish a book and I kind of forget about the theme and go to the next. I'm not loyal to one obsession.
What do you hope that readers will take away from this new reading, interpretation, retelling of Eve's story?
First of all, that strange joy that is to read a novel. Because even though a novel can tell you the most terrible stories, the narration, the telling it, the making one story happen in front of your eyes, gives a particular, extraordinary pleasure to the reader. So that would be my satisfaction, to say so.
The enjoyment of the reader.
Enjoy is the word. I don't know if it's because it's a kind of enjoyment that includes a certain kind of pain, certain little anxieties, but it is a particular form of enjoyment that is so important because it gives us the sense of the others. Nothing more than a novel gives the idea of the others as persons. So there's always a training in reading any novel, the training of seeing the other, knowing they exist. And then the joy of hearing a story and the written word, that mainly. The rest, Eve takes care. She knows what she wants. She wants her version. And I think she delivers it.
I would agree. So, Samantha, what drew you to this novel? What made you want to translate it?
Well, first, because Carmen is the author, and it's so much fun to translate anything that she writes, because the plot is always fascinating, and the characters are always playful, and the language is always inventive and challenging. I think when I was doing my master's at the New School, I audited a course that was called like the History of Religion, and we read the Gathas of Zarathustra, then the first books of the Torah, then the first books of the Bible, then the Quran. And it was very clear to me it was like reading a lineage of the history of like Judeo-Christian mythology. So you could see how in these societies, the same stories are passed down. You get the Mary, the Joseph, and the whole 9 yards. So, as a person who's very aware of the weight that mythology or belief system, whatever you want to call it, has on our society still today, I think it's really important to have, I think, and perhaps it's oversimplifying, but when I was translating this book, I was thinking it's a very necessary corrective to this mythology, which is in some ways so misogynistic. And the dichotomy, the ridiculous dichotomy of the virgin whore, and that's where the whole Eve Lilith thing, so I think that the creation of this Eve is a very powerful antidote to that, and a very necessary thing for our culture. If I could have every high school student read that, and just kind of have like, oh, there's a different way to think about this. And when Carmen, you were talking in the beginning about the birth of the book was looking at the goddess, yes, and exactly. So it's not that has to be the governing myth for all society, right? There are other ways that you can understand how humanity came into creation, and some of those ways actually empower women more.
Obviously, yes. And I think that the fact that Genesis, the official version of the Genesis, was fixed in the moment of the so-called conquest, when the old world was devouring the new world. And it's the moment also when slavery is tagged to that idea of race, because before that, and you have the story of Cervantes, he himself was a slave and was sold back and forth. So it's the moment when the order of things are really fixed, and it's very important that half of the population that happen to be women know that they have been created to serve the other half, because that, since the core of the family, makes legal and authorizes slavery and that order of things. So obviously it's the moment when Teresa de Avila, who escaped from, in her case, not only from being a woman, she didn't want to be like her mother. She says it clearly in her memoirs, terrific book, by the way. She didn't want that destiny, like the mother that died at 36 and had 12 pregnancies, and had taken care of the family and everybody, and died because her body couldn't anything more. She didn't want that destiny, but she didn't want to stay put in the house taking care of the father. And she also wanted to prove they weren't Jewish. So she does what the brothers did, proving they were not Jewish, because Jewish had to be burned, and proving that she was not a woman really, she was something different. She went into this adventure, escaping that order, while the Genesis is fixing that order. And the power of stories, yes, I talked about the joy and the pleasure, yes, but they shape our way of, not only of understanding the world, our feeling, our convictions. And mainly they do it not when they say like this, but when they tell a story. Telling stories is very dangerous and very important and very fertile. And it makes sense. I worry about TikTok. That worries me. Why? Because there's no narrative. There's no narrative. I want to write an essay about it. I have started and it didn't work, and I tried again. It's all are fragments all are things I don't have an account. But I am seeing it, putting this in Instagram, that they asked me to open an Instagram, poor me. And these people, they are all dancing, and there's no narrative, no. So I just can't, I think the world is coming to an end. We are repeating El Mal de San Vito, the dance mania of the medieval times, where all the communities danced till they died. Not all, but towns in hunger and things. Oh, everybody danced, and then they died. No narrative, no sense. So, yes, but I write this book, as I wrote other books, because I want to tell stories. And why do I read novels? Because I need to read novels. Poetry has other role, even more important, but it's not our theme today, so we leave it for now.
So I did want to ask a little bit about the translation work. In a review I read, somebody mentioned of the Spanish that Carmen's prose is pure music. And you mentioned her language just a minute ago. So was the musicality of her prose uppermost in your mind when you were translating this, or were you focused on other features primarily?
I think my first concern was the register, because, there's so many different versions of the Bible, and there's so many different versions of the Genesis story that, I wanted to make sure it was original and true to itself, but also mark for the reader that it was following in the tradition of some of those. So, I remember I had like 3 different versions of the Bible open, and I would compare passages, and, they all begin differently, and they all have they're all translations, so they all have slight differences to them. And that was a really interesting experiment to see. And I think, some of the verbs, like, you wouldn't normally say begat in, regular everyday usage, and things like that were things that I tried to include to kind of locate the reader in the story. But the musicality, for me, it's impossible to replicate the musicality of Spanish and English, because we don't use our vowels the same way, and Spanish is just a much more musical language. So I tried not to be as concerned about that, and just make sure that it sounded, good and fluid and pleasing to the ear, but not, it's just impossible to make all the beautiful O's and A's and some of the rhyming that you get in the Spanish language to replicate that in English.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And could you talk about some particular challenges you had, other than some of the things you just mentioned, the register and the diction?
Do you remember me writing to you about any specific things that I was concerned about?
Or maybe, Carmen, if you had anything that you thought, oh gosh, Samantha's going to have a problem with this.
No, I have a little perverse pleasure with my translators. And it is, when one writes, it's a hard work, and there is anxiety. One feels anxieties and uncertainties, but also the pull, the attraction, to say so. And when I observe Samantha so long, so I observe her suffering, and that's my little perverse pleasure. Because yes, of course, she's writing the book again, and she's writing, to translate is to write. So I'm very respectful, because I know that when one writes, the last thing you want is that somebody spies in your notebook and say, oh, why you did this? No, that is like a very delicate space. And I think that what happens is that you see that notebook all through the time. So I try to just answer and be respectful, and I have that perverse pleasure. There's a lot of suffering in translating.
So you want the
Yes.
translator to suffer as much as you
Yes,
do?
kind of. No, I know it. Even if I don't want it, I see the suffering. I see the suffering. It's something, so I'm not helpful.
No, you're very helpful, because every time I have a question, you're very accessible. You know,
If you
like,
trap me.
and I do. I know how to trap her now, because I've been working with her for a long time. But I think, you know, for me, you know, every decision from the beginning, it gets a little bit easier over time. But even things like choosing the character's name. So, you know, Ara in Spanish. In English, in some Bible versions, is Ada, A-D-A. Here, I put the H on the end, which is in some versions, because I think it's closer, maybe in the reader's ear, to the Spanish pronunciation of the name. But, you know, all that kind of initial work to get it set up, so you have the framework right, it does take some time to make sure you get the tone right in the beginning, and that's something that I think I sent you a passage to say, you know, are you okay with this kind of the slight biblical overtones of the language? And then there's this angel, which is one of my favorite parts of the book, where the angel is
We should
like,
have read that.
well, next time. But the angel is this really formidable,
Glamorous,
yes,
fantastic.
yeah.
I'm in love with that angel.
I think everybody who reads the book will be in love with that angel. But, you know, then little things like the angel should be capitalized or not capitalized, and some of those things, you know, like, because you're talking about other angels too, and some of that stuff never actually gets completely worked out until you're done with the copy edits. You know, because it's a long manuscript that you try to stay consistent, and no matter how consistent you try to stay, there's always little things that sneak in. And that's why we say right here on the cover, uncorrected proof, not for sale. Because they all have little mistakes sometimes.
Yeah. So, one last question. What was most fun for you writing the novel, and what was most fun for you translating the novel? Or we could say most creative.
No, I really don't know. What surprises me when I was writing it, sometimes I really said, why are you writing this? And when I finished the book, I really understood something that I think, but I was acting something I think. And it is something I very easily perceive when I read a 19th century author or Rubén Darío, the poet, when he was young and when he got older, how a writer always is the ear of its time. How always, even though the writer can be writing totally isolated outside of the noise of the world, you are always in, even if you don't want to. So yes, I thought, who is Eve? How come Eve exists? Looking at this image. But at the same time, there was this revival of feminisms all over the world at the same time. And it's not that I was thinking of it, but it was floating all over. All over. I remember in the 70s when I went with my feminist friends, just because I felt compassion for them. There were 9 marching in the streets, 9, 8, 10, 12. They did their efforts. But now, I mean, it's crowds. All are there. And it's like, and they all have different opinions, and it's so alive, and this new wave of feminism is impregnated all over. And I was doing my research without knowing I was one of them. At my 68 years old, I was one of those young ones. I was there. Why? Because I am a writer. And us writers, we write, we live, yes, in a way isolated, but we are sponges. I didn't think, oh, I want to be in the wave of feminism. No, I didn't. I was obsessed about a theme, as I've been obsessed by other themes, but for me then it was so clear. And it's so clear when I'm teaching a novel or a poet. Say, just look at this, how the poem sound, how the poem fractured itself, how come Jose Marti is so different from Ruben Darío, because Marti lived in New York and he was absorbing a total different noise of the times, and Ruben Darío was living in Madrid those years or in Paris, and how did they match? So easy for me to read, but when it happened to me so obviously, I kind of like it. Maybe I learned to read or to write. So that was my satisfaction, pleasure, and fun.
Okay. It is interesting, the timing of this novel, right? I mean, it's almost as if it was planned.
No?
Anyway, Samantha, you most fun, most creative?
So probably the beginning of the novel, because it's a little bit like science fiction. Because in the beginning they have, and I remember when I read it the first time, I was like, what? They have hooves like horses, you know? But they need them to be able to walk down the mountain, and then, you know, over time they kind of wear off and then they fall off, and then they come out of Eden with no genitalia, and then there's a story of how the clitoris was born and how Adam makes his penis, and I was like, wow, this is really far out. And then Eve gets pregnant and gives birth to a horse, and you know, so like there's a lot of stuff that when I was saying like that's the most fun thing to translate of Carmen, like why do I want to translate the book, because it's stuff that, you know, not only have I never seen before or read before, but it's also stuff I've never thought of before. So that's really fun. You know, it's always, when I translate your work, it's always fresh and new and interesting. And as someone who's been an editor for a long time in the business of like reading a lot, sometimes you just get a little bit jaded and like, you see, oh, this reminds me of that. And it's, you know, it's good writing, but it's not like, and you know, for me, when I'm reading Carmen's work, it's like, so.
Okay, so I'd like to open up to questions now for either Carmen or Samantha. Christian?
I love this, everything about it. It's so interesting that I came in here not fully understanding what the book was, but from the title, I figured that it had some kind of biblical undertones going, because that's what I'm doing for my entire senior project. It's kind of also like a retelling, not just of Genesis, but a lot of the divine aspects of the God of the Bible. And so I was very, you know, invested. I love the part that you read. Very bleak, but very much along with the tones that the Bible carries on its own, because a lot of it is already so bleak and so intense, and I just really enjoyed it. A horse? Gave birth to a horse? What inspired that?
They try to have kids differently. So they don't want to have biological, because the truth is that paternity and maternity, yes, they are biological, but just a bit. If we don't really adopt the child we have gotten, that won't ever be our child. It's all a thing that you have to create. If not, it doesn't work. Why it doesn't work? Because it's too complicated. We are too complicated. So I think it's easier to have a horse. Horses aren't easy. So as they try different ways, have it here, put the seed here, what seed, and when they try it, they imagine, how can we have a child? As I do think is the role of having a child. You have to really sort it out and create that space, because if not, it doesn't work, which normally happens. We are most of us are dysfunctional one way or other. So it's what it is. So that's why not only horses, but you will see if you see the book. It's like, goes like.
Other questions?
I have, the artwork is interesting on the cover. Who gets credit for that?
Deep vellum. Yeah.
It's fantastic.
It is. I work with women. I'm a women's healthcare nurse practitioner, and I saw that and I was like, ooh, I know what that is. Yeah. It was, yeah, I think that says, I think the statement is right there. You don't have to open the book, I don't think. Yeah.
You
great.
don't have, it is really a great cover. I
Yes.
admire it. It has a name?
This is the ARC and it just says TK. So I don't know if you have, Riley, does
I
it?
could probably look it up really quick, but I don't know the author, the artist.
The actual
name off
artist,
the top of
yeah.
my head, but I love any book with a yoni on it. You know, we have phallic symbols everywhere.
Yeah, this is great.
I will look it up, so then you can, if you come by a book or something, you can ask me. And I'll tell
Yeah.
you.
So there are a lot of different choices for the cover. I think they give us like 5 or 6 very, very different.
Very, very, very different, but this was by far the best. We fell in love with it.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary. And it makes it to be a kind of beautiful object itself. So yes, we haven't seen yet the definite book.
Oh, the definite cover you haven't seen?
No, I mean, is this?
Well,
But
the final.
The final,
The
yeah,
final.
yeah. Right.
I do have another one, sorry. I think it's very interesting how you took, obviously the Genesis story, but you've modified it in a way. It reminds me a lot of Greek mythologies and just how twisted and interesting they can become. I know there were parts of Genesis that are a bit different from the original to what made you separate, like what parts you were going to keep and what parts you were going to branch out on?
I wanted to do the ones I remembered as a kid. Because I do remember my obsessions with Babel. As a kid, it was like mystifying. And I had thought so many times about that. And evidently Cain and Abel, because why? A brother kills a brother and then goes into exile, but really didn't he? What happened? It's all,
Yeah.
all too confusing. So I always, before I start a book, I always do like a little map. When I already have the tone, when I already have like the tone and the certainty, I do like a croquis or a map. And I did it so like this. The problem were the papers that started appearing in between, because I had her voice and I just wanted to do her voice and I got frequently interrupted. But that isn't the nature of a biblical document. They always have this other, there's a word for it, I don't remember it now. That appear, that happen different voices, different interpretations, different theories. So those were the only that came unexpected. Obviously, the map was not perfect. The map is never perfect. I said, well, they try to have a kid without having intercourse. They try. They come sexless. Why? Because also all these things, maybe because I was young in the 70s, all this sexuality, something you also create. You have to conquer it. If not, you don't. It's not something that you, it's something you have, well, I went to a non-school. My parents took me to mass daily. So the body was evil and all that thing. So how to conquer it? Maybe it was something also so personal. So I went into all this telling a tale also to show that the Genesis is a tale. So I was doing a tale, my own. But a lot of dialogue with my childhood, my imaginary childhood, a lot. So if that explains, and I also, when I divorced of only having the Bible as reference, I was all the time asking the Greek gods, not the pre-Hispanic ones. There was very little material then, now there's a lot. I would be different if I would have spent my teen years reading about the pre-Hispanic goddesses and gods. I would have shaped also another kind of imaginary. I've done it a lot as an adult, I love them. But I used many of my childhood resources, and obviously my teen resources, as I said. And it was her voice. Was beautiful because when I say she dictated it to me, she did. It was wonderful when she started speaking and I said, no, I'm not going to write. I'm not going to write a novel about Eve, definitely not. But I copied it because I couldn't make her stop talking. No? So it flew, and then comes all the correcting and polishing and that work that is delightful, but it came like it was so fluid. Thank you.
You talked about angels and Garden of Eden, but I noticed that top was like sort of void of any mention of God. What role does God play in the book?
Poor God plays almost no role. Poor God is thunder in Eden, and is the thunder that controls everything outside of time. Everything is in order. Is the super God. Only He exists. And all the others are like adornments almost. But she does something when she eats the apple that opens conscience, and she doesn't fit in this space. And it is a godless book, I think. Am I right?
Yes.
It's a godless book, and maybe a godless author. I do have my goddesses. I said I have lots of gods. I have lots of gods. Lots of gods. I had enough when I was a child. They gave me too much. The doses was extreme.
I had a question for the translator. So, a couple of small questions. Like, how long did it take you to translate this book? And what was the process? And what was the most difficult part of translating this wonderful book?
So I think it took me about 4 months to translate, and it was in the summertime. And I was staying in a place that actually had a fig tree, so I could go out and, in the beginning they make their little clothes from fig leaves, so I could go out and look at the fig tree and make sure I was describing the fig tree properly. And I think every translator is different, but for many translators, you can maybe do like 1,000 words a day, but like more than that, you might blow up your brain. It's just like a lot. Especially if you're going to go back and revise and try to polish it a little bit. So that's how long it took. And then, I think for me, always the beginning of the book is the hardest, because especially with this book, I mean, it really was like kind of translating science fiction in the beginning, because I was like, oh, okay, now this landscape was like the fire and brimstone, or whatever. It's not a place that any of us has ever been or seen. You might have seen depictions of it in movies, but this is a depiction that's unique to Carmen's imagination and to this book. So that kind of stuff is more challenging in the beginning to kind of get down, and then going on from there, like I was saying before, getting all of the kind of like the framework in your own head of the characters and how you want to call them, and then making sure that that's staying consistent gets easier the further you go throughout the book. So towards the end, even like if you get to the flood and, you know, what happens with Noah's Ark, that also, you know, it's a more familiar territory. So it doesn't take as long to kind of like go read it, try to translate it, go back, reread it, and so you're not kind of like making sure that everything is correctly reflected in the translation as much later in the process.
And you reread when you continue, when you add the 1,000 words, you read what you did the day before or not?
So do you remember one time I think Hemingway said, always quit before you're done with like whatever you've done, because then when you start writing again the next day, you're gonna have like a place to pick up where you left off. And I think that's kind of true for translation as well. Like, it's nice to kind of finish a chapter, but sometimes I think it's actually more effective where you stop in the middle of a chapter and then you can kind of like, maybe you meditated on it consciously, but maybe you just let it kind of percolate subconsciously, and then when you come back to it the next day, you can kind of pick up where you left off and read through that, and then that kind of sets you up to like keep going.
I always, when I'm working in a novel, before I add words, I start reading the beginning. Always. I go to page 1, and then I read, and then I add. And it, at the beginning, normally, except the one I'm writing, normally they go quite fast, and then much slower because I go and then I add. And then the next day I start and read again, then I add. Then read.
But you always go back to the very beginning?
Always.
Wow.
Page 1. Page
Wow.
1. And then if I get interrupted, I don't add new words. Then next day I start reading at the very beginning, and then I continue.
Do you rewrite?
Oh yes, I rewrite
While
a
you're-
lot.
Yeah.
I make a lot of corrections and rewrite and add little papers.
As you, like every day, you go back to the beginning, and then
Yes.
as you read through what you've done, you are rewriting then or
Yes.
later? Oh, then, okay.
Then and later.
And later, of course.
Even with a really long novel like
Yes.
Lepanto?
Yes.
Ah.
My back, I ended Lepanto with such a terrible problems in my back because the sessions were very long, very long.
Yeah.
Obviously, sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night or suddenly I have an idea and I put in a notebook, this goes this, a little paragraph, this addition. But then to add it, and then I start reading, and then I put it where it goes.
Mhm.
And sometimes I have things in another notebook and then I'm looking for it because I know it goes there,
Mhm.
but I go.
Wow.
The one I'm writing, I start and I erase, and then I start and again I erase, and then I start and I erase.
That one's gonna be a really good one.
Yes, como no.
Yeah.
Only erase is going to be called erased one page.
Riley?
I have a question for Samantha. Do you read the whole thing through before you begin?
It depends on how much time pressure I have from the publisher. So, ideally, yes, but sometimes no. And also depends on the length of the novel too, obviously. If it's a short one, that's easy to do. I remember Gregory Rabassa saying that he didn't read 100 Years of Solitude before he started translating it. He just translated it as he went. And I do think there's something to be said for kind of discovering the work and translating it in that moment of freshness where you're discovering it and translating it the same way the reader's going to be discovering it. But it doesn't work for every book, because if you have a book that's really complex, that's got kind of like pieces that are like a jigsaw puzzle that are linking together, then you can get yourself into a lot of hot water if you make not great choices.
At the beginning.
Yeah.
Yes, it's obvious that 100 Years of Solitude can be done like that.
Yeah.
because the book looks like it's done like that.
Yeah, yeah,
It has a peculiar structure,
yes,
or the structure.
yeah.
Charlie?
Yes, hi. So my question is, Carmen is obviously such a wonderful speaker of English, right? That's not always the case probably when you're working on a translation. But for you, Samantha, as a translator, I guess two questions, right? Are you verifying your translation along the way or just that first part? And then Carmen, do you go back and read the English? And as an entirety, do you go back and read the English novel?
No. I don't work like that with no. I'm a terrible help for my translators.
Or I wonder if
I
that's
answer
better.
their questions and then I pass my eyes like running. Because it's a former novel. I'm not working there. My heart is some other place. I'm in another planet. I'm thinking differently. It's difficult to glue my eyes to it again because I'm in another project. Always I'm in another project. So, no. That's why I know I am horrible to work with. I apologize you too. Because I'm always in other place. I answer. With pleasure I answer. And then I kind of read. But I read like my eyes go other place.
I
Is that
actually,
a good thing, or is that, for you as a translator, is that a good relationship, do you think? or
yes, I think it's a wonderful relationship. I have worked with the other kind of author who wants to like reread and then discuss every word choice. And that's not a good use of anybody's time. Not his time, not my time. And, that's partly what proofreaders and copy editors are for. There's, I think you have to develop some sense of confidence in your translator's ability to render your words in a way that reflects the intent of the original, as well as it can be reflected in a foreign language.
That's super important. She said the key. It just happened to me. They asked me for a piece. I asked if it could be Samantha who was going to translate it. They said they had their own translators. As it was going to be in Italian too, I said, okay. I told Samantha. And then came the English translation, and I did read it from the very beginning. And when the copy editor asked me two questions. The third question, it started there. The third question of the copy editor, I told him, can I see the text? And then he gave it to me, and I read it very carefully. And then the copy editor received it and told me, oh, I'll have to start all over again. Yes, I said, I'm very sorry, I put you to work. No, it's good. But I because I didn't have the trust. I have trust in these persons. That makes me, like I trust them. But I didn't have the trust. And I was right not to have the trust. Kind of. No, yes.
Other questions?
I'm kind of tantalized by the fact that there's Babel. Translating Babel would make me really self-conscious. So I'm just curious what happens and if that happened to you or if you're...
No, because it's more about the hubris. That chapter is more about the hubris of the idea of that there's not so much about language in that chapter. It's more about this crazy idea that, you could get close to God and then, the consequences. So I did not feel self-conscious about that. I did feel self-conscious about other things, but not that. And I enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. And it's so interesting to hear Carmen talking about this, because I'm like, how did she come up with these ideas? And then I hear it's all because it was from your childhood, and I can totally see you lying in bed as a little girl and just thinking, and this is the tower, and it looks like this, and it's going to...
The Noah, the everything.
Yeah.
It haunted me.
Yeah, I believe it.
Hi again.
Oh, sorry, no, I
That's
just
it.
want to pick up on the Babel thing. One thing I thought was interesting in that chapter is that in the end, Eve thinks it was probably a good thing that the peoples were separated.
She likes that.
Mm-hmm.
Why?
Because she had been enslaved. She had been enslaved. she had lost it. Cain leaves, the family goes into the Adam order of things, and she can't stand it. So she leaves, and she's like, she never has her home, and she had been enslaved, is my reading of the case. So when that building in which she also works, as everybody else, falls, for her is a liberation. There's a child there. She thinks a new world can start. It's a new start. And there the book ends, where we know that there was no new start. But that's what she thinks. No, forgot.
Oh, no.
I have a follow-up question. What about the devil? Does he make an appearance?
Does he make an appearance? No, I don't think so. No, he never appears. How strange, he always haunted me as a child.
No. I mean, you could argue that maybe,
No, I don't think there's a character, he doesn't appear.
yeah, I mean, I think the angel in all his
Well.
magnificent hotness could be like a version of the devil, but.
No, that's an angel.
Yeah.
No, don't.
Depends on
say
how
my
you
angel.
define the devil.
Well, but that angel is the one that will provide fire
Yeah,
to her.
yeah.
No, there's no devil. There's no that. Also, God haunted me. I mean, God and the devil haunted me as a child. I was terrified of going to hell. Well, I was terrified of dying. Not because of death, but because maybe I was going to go to hell. I knew I could go to hell. Anybody could go to hell. And it haunted me. It was terrible. So no, strange, he didn't make it. I triumphed over the devil. All in all. I owe him a novel.
That will be a good one.
Yes, that would be good.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I know that some of y'all might have other classes to get to.
But there are books for sale in the back, right?
That's right. Riley is doing book sales back there. These
I have
are
books for sale. I'll give you stickers for free. You don't have to buy a book. I'll give you a postcard for free. You don't have to buy a book. You can scan a QR code because I printed them. And fortunately, the Book of Eve is not out yet. But you can pre-order it, and I'll tell you what the code is to get 20% off because I love giving people discounts. You get a little stamp card, and then they'll stamp it even if you don't buy a book, and then you'll like get discounts on future books. Just come talk to me. It'll be so fun.
well. Thank you, Carmen and
Thank
Samantha,
you.
for being
Thank
here.
you. Thank you.